Hi, I'm the fellow passenger. Today I have the amazing opportunity to speak to Andy Dobson, also known as Digitonal. He has been doing electronic music for a long time, and we will talk about what it's like to perform alongside legendary warp artists such as Aphex Twin, Plaid and B12. We will also delve into his musical roots in classical music and how the future has been an inspiration for him in his work. Before we dive in, I would like to thank all my Patreons for your contributions. That means so much to me, and I would like to give a special shout out today to Ludwig Beck, Mikey McLeod and Reeks Music. I hope I pronounced your names correctly. These three have gone for the mid-tier of my Patreon, which gives them a shout out as well as access to my Discord, so I hope to see you guys there soon. If you like my content, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you can support the channel, please check out the links below, either through Patreon, buying some merch, maybe buying some of my music. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you will enjoy this interview. Hi, Andy.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. Do you prefer to be Andy or do you want to be Andrew?
Do you know what? I'm either.
Okay.
But yeah,
I'll
Andy's.
probably mix and match. Okay, Andy Dobson, also known as Digitonal. It's such a privilege to have you on board and do this chat.
Thank you
so much for joining.
My pleasure.
I think we should just dive right in. I was looking back at a lot of your music now recently, and knowing that this chat was going to come up, and a lot of it brought me back to a particular time that I really loved. And I started thinking, without looking at the labels you were associated with, and I was just like, okay, Hobby Industries, this Expanding Records that was in London, and then I thought of Toytronics, and then I saw like, oh, you're on Toytronics, and then I realized I got some records, but unfortunately not of you. But it's I think that's just coincidence, because if I would have stumbled upon them in 2000 something in a record shop, I would have probably picked them up.
I was sort of the outlier of that scene a little bit, though. I mean, I remember when Toytronic first released 23 Things Fall Apart, the first proper album that I did. Like, there were people, particularly on like internet forums and that kind of thing, that were like, why is Toytronic releasing like music with violins in and stuff like that? Because like Gimmick and Multiplex and all that kind of stuff was very electronica, and then along I came with a string section. So I was always slightly different, perhaps, from everything else that was going on in the scene. Yeah, I don't know.
But it feels like there are those, when I was listening to your music, you get the components of very much that sound, sort of ambient, and that sort of little sort of, what shall we call it? Sort of clicks and cuts type, beats. And then also seeing these, or hearing these orchestral things. And that, I'm just wondering, what's your connection with classical music? Because it feels like there is a lot of that in there.
Yeah. I mean, I was classical music's been central. Like, it's been part of my life since I was a kid. So in my house, basically, we had classical and we had jazz. So my dad mostly listened to old jazz, like swing and Dixieland stuff, and then my mum listened pretty much exclusively to early music and opera. And then classical music, and so we didn't have pop music in the house at all, really. It wasn't until, I don't know, later childhood, maybe 7, 8, 9 years old, that I started to become aware of other stuff. I mean, it was in popular culture, I suppose, and you'd see it on TV and watch Top of the Pops now and again, but it definitely wasn't a big thing. And I was taught as a kid. I mean, my first piano lesson, I think, was when I was 4 years old. I think I'm right in saying that. So I was learning piano from 4 or 5, certainly. I was learning clarinet from 8. and I sang in choirs particularly. So I sang in like church choirs and stuff like that, again, from the age of about 7 or 8. And it was a massive, massive, massive part of my life. And I studied it right the way through school. And then, yeah, so I think when I started writing music, I was writing film music. I was working on short films and theatre stuff in the mid-90s. But then I also, when I moved to London in 1994, and I really got into techno in a really, really big way. So I was going to these techno nights, and I was going to nights like Lost, and I was going to Heaven on a Friday night for Garage, and I was going to Club UK and a few others. But they still had the Art of the Chill Out room back then, so I would find myself increasingly hanging out in the chill out room. And I was hearing, obviously, the Orb and stuff like that, but I was also hearing Steve Reich, I was hearing Philip Glass, I was hearing that sort of minimalist side of things and the contemporary side of things. And I think when I first started writing music, Digitonal started in about 97. I think that's the first time I wrote it down on a piece of paper, having done a few years of doing film music and it not going anywhere, and just started doing my own thing with it. And it basically came out sitting in those chill out rooms, hearing stuff like the Orb, and then hearing stuff like Steve Reich, and then thinking, okay, well, like, I understand the classical components of it, I feel it, and like particularly early music, which is something I'm actually massively coming full circle back to now, like early polyphony and counterpoint and all of those kind of, and just the way that harmony works in a lot of early music, which is the stuff I used to sing, particularly when I was in choirs. Like that, it was the same, and it just matched up, and so really the classical elements of what I did were obvious to me at the time. I mean, there was a few key tracks like Irresistible Forces Symphony in E. Mixmaster Morris was one of the DJs at Heaven on a Friday night in the chill out room very frequently, and I used to follow his sets absolutely religiously. And the first time I heard Symphony in E, which has that violin sample in it was like, oh my God, okay, it works. Like, I knew it worked at that point. And so that's what I sort of wanted to write, because I guess it was a way of staying true to my roots in music a little bit, rather than hearing the ambient stuff that I really loved right from word go, and the electronica stuff, so when I started getting into Aphex Twin and early Autechre and Plaid, particularly Plaid, hearing all that melodic and harmonic content and the stuff that's all very Sarti-like, and basically it was that vibe of the complexity of harmony. I think particularly in the music was what really, really appealed to me. But I also felt that I could be honest about it. I couldn't really represent techno, because that wasn't my world. It wasn't my I mean, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But writing it, I always struggled with it a bit, because it just never felt like it was my roots, if that sort of makes sense.
What about, so the step from, okay, start going to the techno nights and you discover the chill out room and falling in love with that, but then having the background and playing the clarinet and the piano, etc. Did you already have some electronic music equipment at that time, or was it the moment where, like, I just need to make this, I need to go and buy something? Or
yeah, I had the first keyboard I bought was a Yamaha W7 workstation, and it's funny because like people don't talk about workstation keyboards much, or Romplers, or any of that. It's like we look at all the old analog gear, and it was funny because ironically at the time all of that gear was really, really cheap. I think I bought an SH101, and I think I paid like 150 quid for it with a base station rack free, because like nobody cared about it at all. Everyone wanted Korg Tritons and this Yamaha W7, which was it was an arranger keyboard. It had 16 tracks and it had a bunch of PWM waveforms on it, or PWM2. It was Yamaha's proprietary format. And it had a really good marimba sound on it. So a lot of my early stuff, Drenkrom and Carcores from that first album, is basically all on the W7, and it was all learning. And again, I think it was understated. Like I playing about with it, I learned that if I turned the delay feedback up to 99% and hit a chord, it was basically Steve Reich. Yeah, and if I did that on 2 tracks and set the delay time slightly different, then I'd get phase patterns. And so it was like, okay, I can, hey, I can be Steve Reich, with my single little arranger keyboard, and yeah. So all the early stuff was entirely done on that keyboard. I didn't have other sequences. The sequencer was built into the keyboard. They were arranger keyboards. They were made for people in theatre groups or church groups to play their little arrangements on. And then I think the first I bought an Electribe Red, the little red Electribe R box, and that was the first sort of proper drum machine type thing that I bought. And then after that, computer music started to come in, right? So Rebirth came out. When did Rebirth come out? 98 maybe?
Yes.
It was about 97, 98.
Yeah, sometime between 96 and 98.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I had a crack of Cubase. It was before SX even. So I want to say it was Cubase 3 on my PC. And I started doing stuff on that. And then and then Rebirth came out, and Rebirth changed everything. That was the beginning of that. And I'd never had much hardware. Like this period I'm in now is the most hardware I've ever owned in my life. I did almost everything in the box. Excuse me.
So when you were working with the W7 and you were recording your first stuff, at what point did you do any sort of self-release to start with, or playing live, or how did it go from doing that to actually releasing your first record?
Well, again, early days of the internet. So my first gig was at a place called the Purple Turtle in Camden, playing in front of about 10 people. I'd met these guys who ran a recording studio in Tooting called Pangea, and they were world music guys. I can't remember how I'd met them now. I might even have just seen a poster and called them up. And I remember having a chat with this guy, Rob, who was also really into sort of minimalist stuff, and we had a lot of sort of points of reference. And I went down to their studio. It was a little basement of a flat in Tooting that they'd converted into a recording studio. And I was hanging out with them, and then they were putting nights on at the Purple Turtle, mostly world music and fusion nights. So I went down there, and then I met, I was just starting to do web design stuff, which became my career afterwards. I was just starting to get into that, and I built them a website. And I went down to Tooting one day to catch up with them on this website, and I met a band called Aquilina in there, who were a world music fusion band. This guy Joe Aquilina, amazing singer-songwriter guy, and he had a band around him. And he had this violinist, this guy called Sammy Bichet, who I immediately got on amazing with. And he was something else. And I sort of said to him, like, I've got this thing, I've been doing some bits and pieces. Do you want to come down and play? So I started just very loosely playing with him. At the same time, there were some very early web communities that I was a part of. One of them around Warp Records, but there was an offshoot of that called Tefasab that I got very heavily involved in, and ended up co-running it with a guy called Charlie Frame. And that, do you remember mp3.com used to do CDR releases? So we used to do compilations together as a collective. So my very, very first release track was on a CDR compilation called CCOMD that we put together as part of Tefasab, which stood for the Electronic Foundation of Sound and Vision. And it was there were a few, like Oka came out of that. Charlie's stuff is Autofire, Nautilus, who signed to Planet Moo, Cell, who never seemed to blow up, but at one point he was going to be signed to Reflex, and he was massive, like a lot of the US guys. And there were guys that eventually went on to do stuff on Merc and Schematic and those kind of labels that were around the communities in that time. So we were putting these compilations out. I was curating some of them. I was doing some of the artwork. We did a live event, and then off the back of that, I got found by Toytronic. So Martin had pinged me saying, "Oh, I heard this track you did. Do you want to put a version? I've got this compilation I'm working on. Do you want to put a version on it?" And that compilation was Neurokinetic in 2000, which was Toytronic's classic seminal compilation that everyone sort of knows. So that's where the association started. So it was all really just out of doing stuff. I've never sent a demo out in my life. It's a bit weird, actually. We'll probably talk about this later, but I'm sort of starting up some new stuff now, going on to a bit of a different phase and things, and starting to think about how I want to do it. And it's kind of, I'm really loving it in a way, because it's a bit like going full circle back to the idea of small enthusiast communities. There is, obviously, like Point Sorts Arts, who you've just done an album through. I love those guys. I really hope they appreciate how great it is what they're doing, because it is exactly like those early days. It more than anything else that I've come across in 25 odd years that I've been involved in and around the scene of this. Like, they're the guys that feel truest to the grassroots of what this genre always was. No boundaries of genre particularly, but all just really working together as a collective. And I always really, really loved that, and really good things came out of it for me.
Yeah, they're absolutely incredible. So how did you find them? Actually, we're sort of jumping back and forth a bit.
Yeah.
Point Source Arts.
Yeah, I don't know. I actually don't know. I think, I go through little, like, it's harder. I don't know. Is it harder now? I feel like it's harder now to find new stuff and get connected with the new stuff. And maybe it's because I'm pushing 50 now, or maybe it's just because the internet fractured everything a bit, or I genuinely don't know. You had better hubs, because the other side of the story back then were the existence of record shops, and particularly Small Fish Records, which was in Shoreditch, which was, again, it was
I think it's
now
or something.
But even before Shoreditch, in my very, very early days of going clubbing and stuff like that, because the other side, it was the chill out rooms in clubs was definitely when I first formulated a lot of this. But the other stuff is you had Ambient Soho, and you had Silverfish Records up on Charing Cross Road, which I was always a bit scared to go into because it seemed like really adult and serious, and there were people hanging out there that were hardcore people. Someone pointing out Ed Handley from Plaid at one point, and me being all like, oh my god. So there were these hubs again where you would get to meet people, get to know people. Getting to know Mike at Small Fish massively, and Nick as well. I got to know them really well. They were really fundamental to me in the early days. Not only supporting the release on Toytronic, but I did an artist showcase in the store, in the first store before they moved across the road, and that was a really pivotal moment for me. I met Chio from Special Material through that, and got to know those guys. And then that eventually led to me meeting Seed through Chio, because he was working with them at that point. And then that opened up a load of stuff. That's how I got to play in a tube station in Aldwych with Aphex Twin and Goldfrapp. And do you know what I mean? Like, all these things came through just being out and about in a scene. London was very buzzy back then, and it was cheap. You could live in Zone 2. At most. I didn't know anyone who lived outside of Zone 2. So
what was it like playing a gig in a tube station with Aphex Twin and Goldfrapp?
It was, it's really weird looking back at it, and I've got, I don't really see those guys anymore, which is a real pity for a lot of reasons. But I have a real, so it's a very nostalgic thing for me. I think at the time it was always exciting, but also, and this is going to sound a bit odd, but it was just what you did. Like, you'd find a space, any space to sort of play, and the way that things would come about. I don't know much about it because I was never involved in the organization of it, but I think that it was nothing more than one of their mates had a mate who, was responsible for like organizing film shoots in Aldwych tube station, and they were like, yeah, we could probably throw a party, and there were various things that we had to do, hoops you had to jump over to get to do it. But it was just a bit of an organic thing that would happen, and you would just make it happen, like, because there wasn't this music's always been outside of music, right? There haven't been big venues to play in, although actually saying that, I think the other thing which has changed in London is you had much more of a grade of venues. So the other venue that was really important to me was the Spitz. and in Spitalfields, which was a venue over a bistro restaurant in the old Spitalfield market before they redeveloped it all and turned it into, I don't know, bloody patisserie Valerie's and Wagamamas and what have you. You know, it was this old school market space, and they had a bistro. And the great thing about that was it was great sound, perfect vibe, but it had an inbuilt audience. It was a bit like a jazz club in that the audience just went out to have a nice meal and then maybe wandered upstairs to hear some music. So you could be nobody at all, and you could fill a venue and connect to a whole new audience. And I did some crazy stuff. Also, they had a really open-minded booking policy. So they would just put you on. So, you know, I played some electronica nights. I did a thing with Aravane there once, but I also played with Estelle, you know, and I think it was like her second or third gig, maybe. It was an early days gig for her before she really blew up. And it was just a showcase for talent. You know, you just sort of turn up and say, oh, I want to do a thing. And they'd say, okay, yeah, you sound pretty good. Like, come down and do a thing. And so you'd find these little niche venues all around town, or you'd make your own, you know, and you'd find a place to create something. And I do think it was much easier to do it then. Like, you didn't have to have money, you didn't have to have means, you didn't have to have promotion, you didn't have to have followers on Instagram or, you know, X number of streams on some bullshit. You know, it was really like, hey, you know, like, I do a thing, do you fancy it? And you would be able to find a space to create something. And then through that, you'd meet other people that liked it or had an affinity for it. And you'd meet visual artists, and you'd meet people that were making films, and you'd meet people that were putting on festivals. And so, and partially it's probably just being young and going out, which I don't do so much now. And then partially I think it was genuinely that London in the 90s was creative madness. Like, it was the most creative city in the world. It was the most buzzy city. I mean, it really, like, that wasn't hype. It was a real feeling like there was very little mainstream stuff. It was all the underground bubbling up to the point that even, you know, artists like Madonna were pulling out William Orbit. You know, it just really, really felt like the underground was winning a little bit. And it didn't matter what your genre was. The genres were not separated. It was a big melting pot of stuff. You know, so you'd go down and you'd go to the Truman Brewery and you'd hear, you know, Nicolette one night. And, you know, I remember going to see Plaid actually at the Blue Note, and I think it was Plaid and Square Pusher were playing, and I'd never even heard of Square Pusher at that point. I went to see Plaid, and like, I had Björk standing behind me, and you know, it was that, like, that kind of thing. But it wasn't weird. It was just, you were just in these spaces, and things were just happening. It was an amazing place. It was a real privileged time to do it. I think if I'd been even 5 years after it, I don't think I would have released a record potentially. Like, it was a real environment to get stuff done in.
So I came to London in 2004. And even though, like, Small Fish was still around and things, but I found it quite sort of difficult to sort of get into the scene.
Yeah.
And I don't think I mean, it must have been amazing. Just hearing you talking about it sounds like, oh, wow, I wish I was there. And it was those things like growing up in Sweden, just hearing about what's happening in the UK, but it felt so far away and alien. So actually, leading on from that, our mutual friend, Dan, mentioned that, oh, yes, that you helped warp artist B12 to rearrange some old MIDI files or something.
Yeah.
Did you meet them through that buzz and bubbling time? Is that how you got in touch with them?
No, I met them, funnily enough, at a festival in Sweden called Norberg.
Oh gosh, I have never been there. My friends have played there loads. Like, it's
honestly,
all you listeners,
genuinely one of the best weekends of my life. Genuinely.
In an old sort of mining complex.
It was. I can't tell you how mad it was. It was that had been arranged through Josh from Seed, and he got to know them, and he took a crew of us out basically. So there were a bunch of us that went out there. I mean, it was. I've got so many stories. We had Mira Calix with us as well. and Milanese, and B12, and I want to say Eric Schnizic from Seed was there. It was basically a big crew of us. We stayed in these amazing cabins by this lake, which was just, it was like, you know, it was like something out of a drama series, just this perfect, serene thing. And you'd go out swimming in the morning. And then the venue itself was crazy. Yeah, it was a mine. And the main venue had like a 300-foot mine shaft in the middle. And there was no sense of health and safety or whatever. But it looked like the set of Aliens. It looked like the scene at the end of Aliens when they're coming in to rescue them. It was just this massive industrial structure, and people were hanging off the edges of these gantries that you thought would collapse at any point. And it had this massive reverb in there. And then we played in the power thing next door. And yeah, we just sort of, we did a set which got recorded actually for Seed. They put out CDR of it not long after. But it was magical. Everything about that weekend was magical. And then I got to know B12 through that, and I stayed in touch with Steve here and there, a little bit. And then I got a call from him. Basically, he'd had a shout to re-perform Electrosoma, but he'd lost all the original files. And he had like the bulk of the tracks. Oh, have I lost you? Oh no, there we go.
No.
Okay, cool. So he had the bulk of the tracks, but he was trying to recreate the melodies and the bass lines, particularly, so that he could play them off synths. So he could program out actual boxes to do it rather than just playing off stems. And yeah, so I literally sat with Electrosoma and I recreated every single main part of it, which was crazy on a number of levels. Firstly, because that album is just, one of the biggest influences and one of the biggest sort of cultural milestones in music for me, and it doesn't get the props it deserves, in the grand catalogue of things. That it really changed a lot, that album, and so that was a massive privilege, but it was also a massive challenge.
Because why did he ask you to do it rather than him sitting down and sort of doing it himself?
Basically, because he knew that I had just a bit of an ear, and the keyboard skills to be able to, like Steve's amazing, but actually, like an awful lot of electronica producers, he's very, like, they think mathematically, a lot of people. And I've always been amazed. Like, few people I know in the scene used to have this conversation with quite a lot. I genuinely don't, like the tracker guys, I genuinely don't understand how they do it. Charlie Frame from Autofire, who I did all the stuff with Tefsav back in the day, I don't know how he managed to write such melodically and harmonically rich music through trackers. Like, it absolutely used to just baffle me. And I think the thing with Steve was, he had a very sort of procedural way of looking at it, but it had such a lot of emotion in it. But I think he knew that I'd just be able to literally hear the notes and work the notes out. So that was it really. It was just a question of basically what I did it by bringing the tracks up in Ableton, tempo locking it, so getting it into the right tempo, and then literally just going over bar by bar by bar by bar and just internalizing it. Because I can not sight read, I don't know what you call it. I can normally play things back mimetically pretty well. If I hear a melody or a tune, I'll be able to sit at a piano and play it. And then I would play it in live. So I'd hear it and I'd play it in live from the piano. And then that would basically be the notes. And then I do a little bit of editing and just keep going back and say, is that right? Is that right? The good thing about it is it's very, a lot of that stuff was very sort of on grid. So it was, I didn't have to worry about rhythm too much. It was just a question of picking out the subtlety in the notes. And that was cool. And then he performed it down in Camden. It was absolutely incredible and a great privilege to have worked on that. So it's a bit like, going back and remixing your idols.
But did you learn anything through the process, or were there any discoveries where it's like, oh gosh, I never thought about that? Or did you have any of that?
Yeah, I tell you what I did learn is I learned how to write a better bass line. My bass lines have always been whack. They've always been really bass and drums. I always struggle with. Everything else in music, I can normally get my head around. but bass lines particularly I always struggled in. So I definitely learned to write better bass lines, and that was a question of not trying to be overcomplicated actually, and strip things back, like step back a little bit. So yeah, that was really good. And then also, because the other thing actually that I had done with them is, just before I did the Electrosoma thing, I had remixed Soundtrack of Space from Time Tourist, and not Time Tourist, Electrosoma, isn't it? So Soundtrack of Space. So I had done this remix when they repackaged it and they did Last Days of Silence and their comeback, basically. And that remix they had put on the actual album that I'd done, and it was a big string-drenched version of it. I was always completely obsessed with that. But then actually going and working on the real thing. So I think that's actually probably why Steve had called me, because I'd done a lot of reconstruction of that when I did the remix. And yeah, it sort of evolved out of that. So yeah, I mean, it's like, it's always interesting looking at, I try not to be overly influenced by stuff, but it is always interesting looking at other artists and going, right, let me deconstruct exactly what you're doing with that. Like, how are you seeing music? Like, how are you feeling it? Like, it's something I think we really take for granted. And I learned this lesson early on working with Sami, the violinist, because he's Arabic, he's Egyptian, and he works a lot in jazz. And his understanding of music is completely opposite to mine. Like, I can't relate. It's like talking a completely different language. And even thinking in a different way. So he first introduced me to things like tritones, which, you know, any jazz musician will know immediately what that is. But if you've come from a classical background and wait, that's how you're seeing harmony, these sort of different types of inversion going against one another. You know, I've always had my sense of harmony, and how I write is basically counterpoint. It's all just, here's a melody and here's a root, and then you go up against that, and here are the key changes and the chord movements that you go through. It's a very, almost quite boring, actually, traditional way of thinking musically. But these other traditions and how they hear music, whether it's somebody who hears music only in mathematical relationships to numbers, like the Chaka guys, or you know, the Arabic guys who with a completely different sense of what a scale is, even, you know, do you know what I mean? It's like that always fascinates me, and it's really interesting to go down the rabbit hole with that sometimes. And yeah, deconstructing other people's music's a really good way of doing that.
It's interesting hearing you're talking about the process there of, and also your ability to hear a melody and being able to play it back on the keyboard. So that makes the transition into like how you are making music, because when I'm looking at your Instagram posts, for example, or just seeing what's happening in the background, I see modular, I see some Electron boxes, I don't see that many keyboards. So how what's your process for making music today, and how do you translate your classical skills into that world?
I think, like, if I'm really brutally honest about it, I think I ran out of roads a little bit. So two things happened. The first thing was the pandemic, in a really, really big way, and that changed quite a lot of things for me. I think it changed a lot of sense of prioritization. I'd spent a few years in a bit of free fall, and then I did this album with Dom, Set the Weather Fair, which I love, and actually I think it's the best thing I've ever done as Digitonal. And it was a very different process, because I was working with Dom, and Dom and I have worked together for years and years and years in lots of different forms, and we've just hung out. Actually, I just used to go up to his studio. He used to live up in St Albans. I used to go up there on a Friday night and kick things around, and we had all kinds of little projects and little things that we did. And then he started playing with me as Digitonal over the last 5 or 6 years, because I don't like to do it on my own particularly. And then we started writing together, and then that's the album that came out of it. But I was beginning to run out of road, and then the pandemic came. So we'd finished the album by the time the pandemic came. That was in the can and waiting release. And then suddenly, you know, that happened. I was not feeling much like writing music. I was quite scared for a bit of it. It was obviously very uncertain for everybody, those early days of it. And actually then, like a lot of people, I think I started to look at other ways of doing things, basically. And I think Dom had already got into modular before then by a few years. So, you know, there was quite a bit of modular and hardware stuff on the album, but it was all him. So I was still instruments. I was still, you know, piano, and I started learning the cello, and the clarinet obviously was still a really, really key part of things, and very in the box. And then what I found, I started building modular, basically. So what happened is I bought the Moog subharmonicum, and I bought it on a whim, and I started playing with it. And the first thing that happened as I started playing with it was it started tripping me up. So it started basically not doing music in the way that I understood music, if that makes sense. Because the process of it is really different, it challenged me. And I used to treat it as a bandmate. It would burble along and I'd be like, okay, I'm going to try and play against this in the way that I would have done with Dom or Sammy, you know, beforehand, or Callum, when I used to have a drummer called Callum, and he used to, you know, it was interesting playing in a band, because like they would come up with stuff and it'd be like, oh shit, right, okay. Even though I used to write most of it, it was always a really like dynamic process of reaction and response. And that's the bit I love in music. So the thing I love in music more than anything else is that feeling you get where you have genuinely created something in that moment. It's why performance is so important for me. And so playing against the modular stuff became almost a way of tricking myself out of the things that I knew.
Did you enjoy it, or did you hate it a little bit?
A little bit of both, yeah. Well, I started doing these Georgie, Esem and Proem, you know, who I've known at a distance for a really, really sort of long time, Proem particularly. I mean, he and I actually go back a really, really long way, although we've never met. And we did a collaborative album as our 84D, and we've been talking about the stuff, and he was streaming a lot at that point, and then he was like, well, you should start streaming too. And then actually I had bought the subharmonicon, and they very, very kindly and perhaps rather foolhardily sent me another Moog case and a stand and some patch cables, and Georgie very kindly sent me a starter module, and that's what started to get me off into modular. So they were a bit like drug pushers, you know. It was a bit like, you know, hey, go on,
I had a similar story. Yeah, you know, someone gave me the start, and then like
yeah, it's like next time, like you're having to constantly explain to your wife, like, what is this box that's arrived? So like that was the first thing. The first thing was basically the pandemic, being a little bit lost, being a bit confused, not feeling very creative, not going out at all, you know, all of those things when we were locked in for all that time, and I had to find something to do just for my mental health. At the time, I was living with my partner in a very, very, very small flat. I didn't have room for gear, and I particularly didn't have room for my classical instruments. And my cello had become really important to me. So I bought my cello accidentally. I was drunk on eBay one night, and I accidentally bought this cello in about 2015, 16. And I was going through a very, very sort of poor period of mental health around that time. I was really, really struggling with a lot of things, and the cello became like meditation for me. Like learning that instrument became, and it still is to this day, like it became a way of, there's something about doing something that's both physical and mental at the same time. I guess people who are really into exercise, which isn't my world massively, say the same thing, you know. But I love that thing of, it was very cerebral in that there's a load of things you have to constantly think about, but it's also really, really physical, and you feel the vibration of it in your chest, and you feel the way that when your bow hand slightly moves, the tone changes, but the feel of the bow on the string changes as well. And there's this constant loop of feedback going back into you, and as a musician, that's really, really sort of satisfying. And so, but then in the flat, I didn't have any room, literally didn't have any room to play this thing. So it was sort of staying in its case. And then the modular stuff arrived, and it became a bit of a similar process, because it was completely alien to me to think in terms of things like voltages. So it was a very cerebral process in trying to get anything out of it. And I've had this lineup for 4 years now, I guess 3 years. And it's literally only in the last sort of couple of months that I think I'm really starting to understand using it in the way it sort of needs to be used, and not trying to impress my own form of production technique in. Because I think I spent a long time with the subharmonica just trying to make it sound like a normal synth, that I could play with the filter with and play a keyboard against, and it's not until you let go of that machine really starts to sing. I mean, I've nearly sold this so many times because it's just like, this is ridiculous. I can't fucking write anything with this. Like, why am I bothering with it? And then you let go of it and it does something that never in a million years would I have programmed it to do or written in Ableton. And then suddenly it's like, oh, right, I get it. And then it's an instant inspiration thing. And then I'll go to the piano, or I'll dial up a patch on Peak, or I'll go into Ableton and write against it. And suddenly it's a real inspiration machine. And that's what I love about modular. It's been I think music for me, like, it's been a part of my life, as I said, since I was, as long as I can remember, basically my entire life. But I think music has been not just about enjoying music or not just about expressing myself, but it's also been a way of calibrating myself and relating to the world in that way. And, it's so fundamental to my existence like that. Like, it's almost hard to describe, actually. So all of these different techniques that you find, it's like there was a guy on Seed called Ardison, Charles. I haven't spoken to him. I don't know what he's up to now. I haven't spoken to him for years and years and years. And he used to write the most brutal breakcore stuff, like incredibly produced, like one of the best of all of them. This amazing acid inflected breakcore stuff, which I never used to like it as a genre particularly much, but his stuff was just so amazing, so good. Bit of electro in there as well. And then he went off and joined a gamelan orchestra and got really into gamelan, which you would have thought couldn't be more far removed from it. But I remember talking to him at the time, and it was like, I mean, it was more of a sort of, I guess, a mindfulness practice for him. But also musically, you started to see the common root of some of these things, and you start to see where things link. And actually, it's those transitions and those intersections of things where I think the most interesting music is to be found. So even in my very crude way, when I rewind all the way back to the late 90s and sitting in those chill out rooms, I think it's that I was responding to. I think it was when Morris would, have just brought in a tiny little bit of bark under something, or, there were all those old EMT records or emit records, stuff that were really sparse and beautifully ambient, but you could mix almost anything over the top of it. And then you'd listen to something like KLS Chill Out, which obviously did that. And then Future Sound of London, who, I should mention them an awful lot more, actually, because I think Irresistible Force, Future Sound of London, particularly Life Forms, and Black Dog Productions, Bites, and then probably, Different Trains, Steve Reich's Different Trains. I think those were the records without which I wouldn't even have occurred to me to try and make music, or certainly not make electronic music. I probably would have been a classical composer or a film composer or something like that.
So you've alluded to something is changing in your musical life at the moment. And you mentioned sort of going back to the roots. Is that to do with the early music, or what are you thinking? I would be interested to hear where are you going next?
I've been having a real long debate in my own head, and I've had it with a few other people as well. I've been sense testing it for a really long time, and I think so. Basically, what I'm planning to do is probably put Digitonal to bed, and I'm not going to kill it, because I think that it's really difficult. Like, it's a fundamental part of my identity, not just my creative identity, but my personal identity. I came up with it in 97. It's 25 years. Like, that's a really long time to do something. And I think what I came to realize over the last 3 or 4 years of doing it is that it had become a bit too much of a box with expectation. And, not that I was ever massively commercially successful, or not that there's, a huge weight of people saying, play us, come and play, or, Drencrom from back in the day. It's like, I'm very fortunate actually that the project's been allowed to evolve and change, and every record's been different, and it's been a different lineup, and I've worked with lots of different people, all wonderful musicians and wonderful contributors, and my way I write music has changed and changed and changed and changed, but it's always been under this one umbrella. And even though I've had a lot of flexibility with what I do like that, it's just felt lately like it's too much of a box. And I guess what it is I've always wondered what it would feel like just to let it go, and just do something completely different. And then you sort of realize, well, you can, and lots of artists have alter egos, and lots of artists do different things. And when I did the collaboration with Pro-Am a few years ago, we did that under a different name, and I mean, it was literally like completely ignored. Like, I don't know how many records we sold, but it's made no impact on anything. But the process of doing it, because it was genuinely different, that record. Like, it doesn't sound like Pro-Am or me. It sounds basically like I've gone to Pro-Am and made him really pretty, or Pro-Am's come to me and made me really weird. It's sort of like, again, like that sort of intersection point. That's the thing that's really interesting. But then the other thing is I've always done things in collaboration. I've worked with all these wonderful people over the years, and Dom and I are still working together, but he moved to Utrecht a few years ago. We don't see each other quite so often as we used to. And I have been doing a lot of stuff solo, and a lot of Digitonal stuff had been solo. I performed on my own before. Probably about 30% of the tracks are just me without other collaborators, and I've done things for compilations and remixes, and mostly just me. But I just thought, I needed to find a different way of exploring things. And some of it might sound like Digitonal, but it's hard to describe. It needed to feel like it was a different project, because then it frees me up from having to bring it back. So I can go off on a little meandery journey through some of this stuff. And then the other side of things is, I've recorded for Just Music, for the last 3 or 4 albums, and who are an absolutely amazing and wonderful label, and I love working with them, and I hope we'll continue working with them. But they're putting stuff out. Like, there were always a lot of conversations about things like track length, and Spotify playlisting and the algorithm. And basically, the short version is, sorry, it's really a real ramble, but the short version is, what I've come to understand is I really hate having an expectation, or doing stuff to meet somebody else's idea of what it should be. And that might not be a fan base necessarily, because that's small, but it actually is more likely to be what Spotify thinks I should be doing, or what a festival booker thinks I should be doing. Like, I noticed it a bit. I used to work with the Big Chill a lot when that was still around, and I found myself, trying to write things with like, would the Big Chill like this, or would the audience for a certain type of event like this, or would a certain type of club like this? And it's awful. Like, it feels awful. The music that comes out of it is shit. Like, it's just an absolute waste of time. So I'm doing 2 new projects. There's one thing called Alpha Box, which is really just me returning to straight IDM, unapologetic. All sounds like plaid, basically. I don't care, because I love it, and I've always written stuff like that. Hopefully, it's still me and not just biting Ed and Andy, but it's that playfulness. It's a bit more up tempo. It's a bit more fun with its beats, and it's old school IDM through and through. And that is just great, and I love it. And I'm doing some tracks like that. But then the bigger thing is a thing called Of the Night Sky, which is going to be unapologetically conceptual. So, I'm at a point now where I just want to make art. And as you know, I've moved out to the Suffolk coast, and that has been a really, really big change for me, not only in terms of my lifestyle, But I got married again, and I moved into this wonderful house, and I've got a proper working space. But I'm at a different center of gravity and a different lifestyle, and the coast is so inspirational. I came here in 2015 at an incredibly low ebb in my life, and I had to do a lot of thinking and a lot of change. I had to change a lot of things about myself, and I came out of that trip particularly. So really, this change in Digitonal has been 7 years in the making, really, because I think that was the first time I felt I needed to, in order to go forward, I had to let a lot of stuff behind, if that makes sense. So Of the Night Sky is long form ambient. It's the generative and process music from these kind of things, but with the classical elements in, but it's just me. And it's exactly what I want to express. And it's linked into visual work, which I've started doing over the last 4 or 5 years. I learned touch designer. I've been doing some filmmaking. I have broadened a palette of abilities to do some stuff like that. So all of these things have come together and they've formed something. And it was very up in the air until probably about 6 months ago, when, having moved up here, 6 months ago, 4 months ago. So having moved up here, I had a sense of place again. And I felt, do you know what? I can put a stake in the ground. I know exactly what it's about. It's about permanence and changeability. And it's about this landscape. And it's about me, now nearly 50, my life having gone through so many different phases, many of them good, some of them appalling, and having seen that kind of change in myself, it just didn't feel like I could still make music like I was starting to Toytronic anymore, because that belonged back in 2000, you know.
Can the listeners hear your new projects yet, or are they still?
They're still cooking a little bit. I am going to start getting some stuff out. I've done a couple of live gigs. So I did my friends' festival together last year. I played a gig as Alphabox. I've been keeping very incognito about it. There are a few people that know, and I've started talking about it on social media. I've actually just today I was building a website for one of the things. Of the Night Sky, I'm not planning on releasing anything yet, because I'm still exploring the process a bit. But I did put down an hour of music the other day. I did a performance end to end, so I've got material. Alphabox, there is an EP, which is very nearly finished. It's already late, actually, which I think VSLI are going to put out. And we're just sort of getting to the final stages of that. And I've just got to do a final mix down of it. So that will hopefully be out fairly soon.
Exciting. Before we wrap up, there's a couple of things. First, if you would like to recommend something to listen to, an artist or a particular album, it could be something that you expect most people would know, or it could also be something, and it doesn't need to be the best music ever. It's just literally today. What would you like to recommend?
I'll tell you the album I've been listening to more than anything else in the last month has been Alchemist's Bringbacks, who's a jazz artist. I don't know much about him, actually. It's one of those things that I think somebody had said, oh, you might like this. I'm very late to jazz. Like, it was always around, but I didn't. And obviously, very old school jazz. My dad sort of brought up on it, but I've come into it again lately in a really big way. Daniel Casimir and people like that, and EST really belatedly. But then Alchemist Bringbacks, I've been obsessed with that album. It's immediately. It's funny. It feels nostalgic in that it feels like a sort of Soho coffee shop in 1996, but it also feels like it's beaming in from the future a bit. And it's just, again, it's the harmonics of it. It's just harmonically, it's so interesting. And one of the things that I'm really trying to do, particularly with Of the Night Sky, is push myself, be bolder and braver, and get away from my usual chord shapes and arrangement styles and time signatures and all of those constructions. So that's been really inspiring, actually. That's really one to check out. And it's a couple of years old now, actually, but that's a great album.
I'm sure we can find some links to put in the description, and also we shall make sure that we got some links to Andy's music. And also, let's keep our ears open for the new projects coming out soon. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel like, oh, I would like to mention this? Or is there anything that we've missed, anything significant? I suppose one name that I've written down is like Max Richter.
Yeah.
Or is that just going to open another big?
No, I don't. You know what? I mean, again, it's like I like don't. So I did the remix for Sleep, and that came. There was nothing more to that than I happened to be sitting with Serena Benedict from Just Music when she had got a call from Deutsche Grammophon because they were negotiating. I think they wanted John Hopkins to do a remix, and or I don't know, something like that. Anyway, there was she knew the people there basically, and she was on the phone to them. And then she just turned to me and said, "You don't fancy remixing Max Richter, do you?" And I was like, obviously, of course. But again, really, really funny, just really quickly, there's real funny little synergy with that because, so, you know, my music's been described as neoclassical. I was sort of, I hate to say this, but I was doing a lot of that stuff, the naive piano stuff and all of that back in the 90s, like a lot of my early stuff, not necessarily stuff that got released, but when I performed, I would do quite a lot of that, you know, before Olafur and Niels. But Max Richter, there was a guy called Richard Harris that used to live across the road from my grandmother in Lewisham. And when I was a very little kid, I used to go over there, and she was this absolutely wonderful, wonderful woman. And she'd come and give me a big hug, and she'd bring me into the house and feed me loads, Italian, feed me loads of stuff. And I met her son, Richard Harris, who was a bit older than me. And then when I was a bit older, he went off and went to music college. And I was really I was probably about 10 maybe at the time. And I was like, oh my God, that must be amazing. You know, I was really into classical music and piano, and he would sit down and play the piano and crazy. Anyway, he went off to the Royal Academy, I think, and he formed Piano Circus with Max Richter. And that was the first recording on Argo that I had of Six Pianos by Steve Reich was his recording with Max Richter as Piano Circus. And so there was always this weird little connection to contemporary classical stuff. And I will admit that I've had a really uneasy relationship with a lot of that stuff because I'm not of that world. Like, although I have this classical background, I didn't go to music college. I wasn't part of the Royal Academy contemporary music groups. I've met a lot of people. Richard Lanoy and I were doing a thing called Subversion back at Bartok in the early noughties, which was the first classical club night. And then I've gone on to see non-classical, and I've gone on to see, there's a new one actually at the moment called Counter Chamber or something like that. I saw it the other day. So these things come round and around and around as new generations of music students sort of realize, hey, clubbing and classical, you know, that's great. But I was never really a part of that world, even though I was doing it. So, you know, that track Overline from the first Toytronic album, you know, which is 303 bass against a string quartet effectively. You can draw a line of it from Michael Gordon and what Fat Cat Records were doing with their early classical stuff, and then Future Sound London, which of course Max Richter played on that track on Dead Cities with them, Max. And you know, there's all these weird little synergies, but I've never met Max Richter over all of this period. And so I got the call to do this remix. I was like, absolutely. Also, here's another interesting thing. Grace Davidson, who is the voice on Sleep, and I'm very fortunate because I've got the original samples from doing the remix. She used to sing, actually maybe she still does sing, with the 16, and the 16 are the preeminent early music choir. And I know we haven't talked about much about that. It's not particularly important, but my roots are very much in early music and Renaissance music particularly, and the 16 are the choir. I've seen them for years and years and years, and it's Grace singing on from Sleep. So to be honest with you, I think I'm more excited about having worked with Grace Davidson, theoretically, than Max Richter himself. I mean, it's a wonderful record. And do you know what? No matter what else I've achieved or not achieved, because, you know, it never made me any money, this stuff, and I've still got a day job, and, the albums did what they did, but I have a piece of vinyl upstairs with my name on it and a Deutsche Grammophon label logo on it. So no matter what else I do or wherever anything else
hold
goes,
on to it.
I've got that. I've got that. It's up on my wall upstairs. I'm very, very, very proud of that record.
I think isn't there some techno artist, when they release an album, they've taken that Deutsche Grammophon, the big yellow, and just like copied that look.
It's iconic, isn't it? It's like, it's one of those things. Those are the records that I grew up with. My mum had, Herbert von Karajan's Beethoven recordings with that yellow logo on it. I mean, it's I guess when I was a kid, and I never had any massive ambitions to be a soloist or to be a classical musician. I just loved music, basically. But those were definitely the things that you would look at and be like, these are the most famous musicians in the world. This is the sign. It's a stamp that you have created something worthy of the canon. And so, like, regardless of whether I have, if my output over the last 20 years, I don't think it's made any particular cultural impact, but it's a wonderful feeling to know that there are some things that I have done along the way that have can stand up next to all of that. It can stand up next to my peers and my heroes, and it was a bit like going back to that B12 thing. It was the same thing, like doing Soundtrack of Space and doing that remix for B12, and then having them release it on their label, and then doing the reconstruction and all that kind of stuff. It's just another thing. I do sometimes feel like I've been 20 feet from stardom a little bit, because I've been around the scene such a long time, and I've played with Plaid, and I've played with Richard James, and I've done all this kind of stuff here, there, and everywhere, but my own little thing never sort of made it, I suppose. But I can be incredibly proud, I think, of the contributions that I've made. Yeah. So thank you for mentioning the Max Richter thing. It doesn't get talked about much. Actually, the other thing about that Max Richter thing is the last record that I made with Sammy playing violin, I've underplayed it, actually, to be honest, because he's been the most vitally important thing. His violin work, I expressed things that I couldn't have done. And also with Kat Arney playing harp, who was a wonderful collaborator for many, many years, and toured with her, and wrote loads of music. And it was that's probably the classic Digitonal lineup, and that was the last record that we ever made together, before we all went off into our different life paths. And so it's a nice way of, I guess, now I'm going off on my own new little journey, having moved out of London and remarried, and all of this kind of stuff. Is just like, it's I think the path of an artist, it was a really important reminder to me that you actually, whatever happens, you do have some control over this, like for right or wrong, or for better or worse. Not to say that this new stuff's going to be any better than the other. It may be, it may not be, it may be more successful, it may be completely ignored, but
it's liberating, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, I'm just not going to be in the box and whatever comes out of it, but you're probably going to have some good adventures on the way.
Yeah, like Michael Marshall Smith, wrote a book called Only Forward, which is a really stupid little sci-fi book. But I think about that all the time. It was the working title, actually, for Alpha Box for a long time, was Only Forward. And I just, like, here's another weird thing, right? Electronica was always the music from the future. I know before we started recording, we talked about Jean-Michel Jarre and being such a vital influence on me when I was a kid, like seeing that stuff and going, oh my God, what is this? It's incredible. And it's because it felt like it was beamed in from the future. And the first time I heard Autechre, it was like it was music from the future. And the first time I heard Future Sound of London, literally called Future Sound of London, it was music from the future. And so the nostalgia parts of it now, where we look back at the 90s, it's lovely because it gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling, and I was there, and it was amazing. It was amazing. It was an amazing time to be a musician, amazing time to be around culturally in the scene, particularly in London. But as a musician now, I cannot just stay there, because it's comforting and lovely. But as an artist, you have to go forward, because it was always about the future for me. And
need a bit of the future again. Yes, I can totally sympathize with that.
It's like, do you ever feel, I love all the old analog boxes, of course I do, but do you ever feel like what's the synth of the future? Like what's you know, I feel like the manufacturers have spent a very, very long. It's one of the other things I love about modular, actually. The mutable instrument stuff felt like it was a new form of design. It felt a new form of synthesis almost. It felt like it was music from the future. And as much as I love a Juno, you know, it was like, guys, we have been there for a really, really, really long time now.
And I also think like it's something happens when a music manufacturer start making an instrument for a particular purpose. Like when those old analog instruments, the way they started being used was in a way that they were never intended to be used.
Yeah.
So I mean, maybe
yes.
maybe a lot of that is going to happen with some of the equipment that's being made now, like made to make techno or whatever. When someone takes that piece of kit and just uses it in a way that it was never intended, and all of a sudden, the future.
So you know, again, going back to that track Overline from 23 Things Fall Apart, I wrote that back in '99, I think, originally, and it was basically Rebirth had come out. Everyone was going mad for acid house. It was the first rediscovery of acid house. And you know, all these acid tracks, and I knew a lot of people around that were doing a load of acid stuff. I took that and I was like, that bass line, that the resonance, if you take the resonance right up on that, but you just program it not like a repeating bass line, it sounds like a ground bass. It's basically like a Purcell style ground bass. So I wrote a Purcell style ground bass, and then Sammy came and recorded violin, and we built up the string quartet over it. And that track basically came out of exactly that, just listening to something and thinking, what is this? And it's almost like going full circle back on the 303, where people, you know, it was made to be a bass guitarist replacement. And a bunch of people found them in thrift stores and were like, nah, man, this invents a new genre of music. So I think, you know, like that's part of the journey of experimentation with any of this kind of kit. Like I bought Push actually after seeing Warrington Runcorn. I played a gig with him just before Christmas, and I came out there and seeing how he was performing, and I was like, actually, that might really work for me. And even the thing of like the different chord shapes and the difference in the Ableton workflow has now changed my Ableton workflow. So again, anything that can break my habits, that can get me into a new frame of mind. Don't get me wrong, I'm still always going to write melody and harmony, and it will probably all sound roughly like me. But, you know, I always have to definitely feel like I am going only forwards, because whilst the past is a whole mixture of things, it's triumph and it's tragedy and it's comfort, definitely, and the nostalgia is nice, particularly when the world is a dreadful place. But also, like, I got into this music because I was curious about the future, and I feel like that's why I feel like I'm having to reinvent now, because otherwise I'm going to continue writing music like I'm still in a coffee shop in Soho, or sitting in a field at the Big Chill in 2004, which, don't get me wrong, was an absolutely great time, and I loved it, and I loved all those, you know, those hangouts and all the people that I worked with. But
time to move on.
Gotta have something new. Gotta have something new.
This has been super interesting. Thank you for sharing all the stories, your way of thinking, and definitely make sure to check out some of the links that we will put in the description, and your favorite artists and your music. And it will be interesting to hear what's going to come out of your new projects. Thank you so much for your time. That's been amazing.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.